My name is Lila Mercer, and on my 42nd birthday, my father slapped me across the face in front of everyone. The sting wasn't just on my skin, it was the echo of every time he had silenced me, every time he had turned love into punishment and control. That night at his birthday table, with his handprint burning on my cheek, I realized this wasn't discipline, it was violence. And for the first time, he was about to learn he couldn't own me anymore. I can still recall the salt in the air drifting in through the restaurant windows, mingling with the buttery scent of garlic from the seafood just placed on the table. The white tablecloth gleamed under the candles, a perfect stage for what was meant to be a celebration. For a moment, it looked like a portrait of family harmony, until his hand cut through the air and struck me across the face. It happened because I had leaned toward my mother and gently reminded her about the bread she'd left in the oven. Just a soft note, no edge in my voice. But to my father, any sound that interrupted his ritual of prayer was an act of defiance. The crack of his palm was louder than the surf outside. The entire room froze in its wake. My mother dropped her spoon, red sauce blooming across the tablecloth like a wound. My brother jerked his hand from his mouth, where he'd been gnawing at a fingernail, shrinking instantly into silence. My cheek burned hot, but I straightened my spine, forcing my hand to wrap tightly around my water glass. I was 42 years old, a brigadier general in the U.S. Army, and yet in his eyes, I was still the child he could correct with a single strike. The silence was suffocating, thick as a curtain pulled across the table. My father folded his hands again, as if nothing had happened, and muttered that we should continue with grace. He expected obedience to follow, the same obedience that had kept this family silent for decades. But this time, someone else broke the pattern. Quinn Park, the colonel who had accepted my invitation, set her wineglass down with measured calm. The tip of her finger tapped the rim, clink. The sound was small, but it carried like a gavel striking wood. Every head turned. She met my father's eyes with unshaken composure, her voice steady, low, and final. Not tonight. In that instant, something cracked. The kingdom my father had ruled with fear and ritual was no longer whole. He didn't notice the fracture, not yet, but I did. The balance of power at that table had shifted, and the birthday dinner he believed he controlled had become something else entirely, a battlefield, though he didn't yet know he was already losing. The heat on my cheek hadn't faded when the memory surged back, sharp and uninvited. I was 12 again, knees pulled tight to my chest in the damp basement my father called reflection time. The air smelled of mildew and rust, every drop of water slipping from the leaking pipe striking the concrete like a clock meant to measure my submission. Hours passed in silence except for the scrape of my breath. If I cried, the walls only echoed it back to me, proof of weakness he would use as ammunition later. It was there I learned to slow my breathing until panic dulled, to let pain settle in my bones without breaking me. What he thought was punishment was training, though he never understood that. By the time I enlisted, I already knew how to endure beyond exhaustion. Long marches through the mud, endless drills, nights awake under freezing stars. Those were just another kind of basement. Only this time, endurance was no longer survival alone. It became the foundation of command. I wasn't the victim of those hours anymore. I used them, turned them into steel. And still, whenever I returned home, I felt the shadow of that basement pressing in. On the attic floor above, I kept a trunk hidden beneath old boxes and dusty holiday decorations. Inside lay the desert-stained uniform, photographs folded until the creases scarred the faces, and letters written in a code only I could understand. It was my secret archive, proof of a life he could never reach. Each time I opened it, I reminded myself that I had stepped far beyond the walls he once used to confine me. He believed those blows, those hours in the dark, had bent me to his will. What he never grasped was that every strike had sharpened me instead. He hadn't broken me. He had forged me into a weapon he could never wield. My father began the blessing, voice steady and self-important, filling the silence with words about family, discipline, and gratitude. Each syllable dropped like a command, meant to keep us bowed beneath his order. To me, the cadence was hollow, static hissing through a broken radio. Then Quinn interrupted. The tip of her fork tapped the rim of her glass. Clink. The sound cut his sermon clean in half. She lifted her gaze, cool and unwavering, and asked the question no one had dared to voice. Do you often strike your daughter before meals, or was tonight special? The metallic scrape of my brother's fork slipping from his hand filled the pause. My mother froze, spoon trembling between her fingers. My father gave a short, brittle laugh, the kind he used to mask his rage. It was correction, he said flatly. This family doesn't need outsiders meddling. Quinn placed her glass back on the table with deliberate calm. Her voice carried no heat, only certainty, as heavy as a verdict already written. Correction, I call it assault. The word split the air wider than his slap ever had. For the first time, someone had named it for what it truly was. I locked eyes with him, refusing to look away, and in the flicker of candlelight I saw it. The slip of control he didn't recognize yet. He still thought this was his house, his rules, his kingdom. But from that moment forward, it was no longer just a family matter. It was law. And he was about to discover that his dominion ended where justice began. The blade glinted under candlelight as my father tightened his grip on the prime rib knife. He leaned toward me, voice a low hiss meant to slice just as clean. This is my house, my rules. No one tells me how to raise my children. The table fell into a suffocating stillness. My mother's head bent so low, her hair brushed the rim of her plate. Lips trembling, fingers clenched around a silver spoon until her knuckles whitened. My brother stared hard at his food, shoulders locked, jaw tight. I sat upright, hands folded in my lap, motionless but steady, the thud of my pulse the only movement I allowed. I'd commanded troops in combat zones, spoken under oath before military boards, yet nothing rattled my heartbeat like the sight of him across the table. The man who had trained me to believe silence was survival. Quinn tilted her glass, eyes sharp as steel, but her voice light as a breath. Not tonight. The words carried the weight of an order. They sliced through the air, and for a moment, the knife in his fist sagged slightly, the illusion of absolute control weakening. Then it came, barely a whisper, but explosive in its impact. Dad, stop. My brother's voice cracked like glass, two fragile words spilling into the silence. It was enough to rupture the ritual. My father's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. The boy dropped his gaze instantly, words strangled in his throat, but what was spoken could not be unsaid. I caught the flicker of my mother's hand, trembling mid-air as if she meant to place it on his wrist, to hold him back, but she faltered, lowering it without touching him. Her hesitation was more damning than any confession, years of paralysis crystallized in that single, aborted gesture. I met my father's glare and did not blink. In the quiet that followed, I felt the fortress he'd built around us shift. His reign was still in place, but a fissure had opened, and once a wall cracks, it never holds the same again. The next move wasn't mine. Quinn set a small black case on the table beside the cranberry sauce, her composure unbroken. With deliberate calm, she flicked it open. The gleam of military credentials caught the light, metal edges shining like another blade pointed at his illusion of authority. He snorted, the sound brittle, a laugh masking fury. You think a few pieces of paper give you the right to preach to me? She's my blood, my daughter. I'll discipline her as I see fit. Quinn's gaze never wavered. That isn't paper, that is law, and law doesn't vanish at your doorstep. The room vibrated with tension. Then my father's face twisted. He spat his trump card, voice thick with spite. I reported her. Stolen valor. I sent the files. You think I don't know she fabricated all of this? I stayed silent. I didn't need to answer. Quinn reached calmly into the case and drew out a sealed envelope. With precision, she unfolded the contents. My DD 214 discharge papers, my promotion orders to Brigadier General, signatures and official seals stamped in ink, evidence too heavy to deny. The color drained from his face, his smirk collapsing into something colder, weaker. Then came another sound, sharp as a hammer striking a coffin nail. My brother's glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the floor, shards scattering across the tile. Everyone flinched at the sudden noise, but its meaning was undeniable. Something had broken beyond repair. The air itself shifted. The table was no longer his throne, no longer the altar of fear where we bent our heads. It had become a tribunal. The credentials gleamed in the candlelight like evidence on display. Witnesses surrounded him, silent but present. His power was no longer unquestioned. It was on trial, and the verdict was already circling the room, waiting for its turn to be spoken. The air in the dining room thickened, heavy as if the ocean breeze outside had been shut away. The credential case still sat in plain view, its metallic insignia throwing cold light across my father's face. He gripped the prime rib knife tighter, knuckles trembling even as his stare tried to hold steady. Then came a sound I will never forget. Measured footsteps, leather soles striking hard tile in deliberate rhythm. Not the shuffle of waitstaff. This was different. This was official. My mother gasped softly, hands twisting her napkin until it nearly tore. My brother's eyes darted to mine, wide with panic. "They're really here?" he whispered. The door swung open, and 3 deputies filled the threshold, black jackets gleaming with polished badges. My father's color drained. He raised the knife instinctively, an old soldier's reflex to defend his territory. A voice broke the tension from across the table. A silver-haired man, one of my father's longtime friends, pushed back his chair. His stance was firm, voice gravelly with age, but steady with conviction. "I saw him strike her. Right here, at this table. I'll testify." The room erupted in silence, more deafening than noise. My father's face turned crimson, rage trembling through his jaw. "You dare betray me?" he snapped. But the veteran's calm stare did not waver. He was no longer afraid. The knife slipped from my father's grip, clattering against a plate, the metallic clang echoing through the stunned room. He shot to his feet so fast the chair toppled backward, rattling the table. My mother's spoon slid from her hand, sauce streaking the pristine tablecloth in a red smear that ruined the illusion of order and tradition. The picture of the perfect family lay shredded before everyone's eyes. I sat unmoving, breath slow and measured. I didn't need to speak. Justice had stepped across the threshold on its own. One deputy advanced, his voice clipped and formal, like the striking of a gavel. "You are under arrest for the assault of a United States general." The words landed like a verdict already passed. The room froze. All I heard was my own heartbeat, not with fear, but with the steady thrum of a reckoning long overdue. My father lunged, voice breaking into a growl. "She's mine! My blood! My child! No one takes her from me!" The declaration rattled off the walls, empty and desperate. My brother's head snapped up, his eyes locking on our father, with a look that held more disbelief than fear. It was as if he finally saw the man for what he truly was. The deputies seized my father's arms, his struggles clumsy, stripped of the authority he once wielded. The fight looked less like defiance and more like flailing. Then came the sound that ended it, the sharp sakho, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut. The noise reverberated like the period at the end of a sentence, written across decades of silence. My mother buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking uncontrollably. My brother shoved his chair back, the screech of wood against tile screeching through the room like the last groan of a collapsing house. As the deputies pulled him toward the door, he turned back. His eyes, for the first time, weren't blazing with fury. They were wide, brimming with fear. His protests stumbled into incoherent denials, swallowed by the heavy march of boots on tile. The door slammed shut behind them, And what followed was a silence I had never known in that house. Not the suffocating silence of control, but the hollow quiet that comes after ruin. It was the silence of collapse, the silence left in the wake of an empire finally fallen. The headlines arrived faster than I could brace myself. Community leader arrested at his own birthday dinner, reporters called, but I answered none of them. Outwardly, I stayed silent, but inside, I knew the storm had only begun. When the trial opened, I slipped into the back row. My uniform stayed at home. I wore plain clothes. No medals to prove anything. I didn't need symbols to legitimize me. His lawyer painted him as a stern father, misunderstood, a man of strict love. The performance wavered the moment the courtroom doors creaked open. A silver-haired woman entered, clutching a worn leather bag. She trembled but walked with purpose. I had met her once, weeks earlier, in a quiet cafe. She'd slid that same bag across the table, her voice shaking as she whispered, "The truth can't stay buried forever." Now, its contents spilled into evidence: hard drives, spreadsheets, contracts, proof of embezzlement from veterans' funds, bribes hidden in shell accounts, falsified invoices. The judge read aloud line after line. Each email, each figure, each fraudulent expense landed like a hammer pounding nails into the coffin of his reputation. His face flushed, sweat beading down his temple, hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles paled. In his house, he'd believed he was untouchable. Here, he was only another defendant beneath the law. Then the secretary spoke. Her voice quivered but cut clear through the hush. She described nights of intimidation, the threats that had silenced her for years. The gallery leaned in. No one moved. My mother sat on the witness bench, tears sliding down her cheeks soundlessly, her shoulders shaking as if every word confirmed what she had long known but never dared to speak. I drew a slow, steady breath, my back straight. No gloating, no smile. The truth didn't need my triumph. It was enough to watch it rise in the room, undeniable, heavy as judgment itself. The empire my father had built on fear and facades was collapsing, and this time, I didn't have to lift a hand. Justice was doing the work on its own. The morning was sharp with cold when I stepped into the visitation room. The stench of disinfectant clung to the air, sterile and suffocating. Fluorescent lights flickered above, bleaching the walls of any warmth. Then he appeared, smaller than I had ever seen him, swallowed in gray prison scrubs, shoulders hunched, eyes still trying to burn with a power long gone. He dropped into the chair opposite mine, leaning toward the glass, voice a gravelly snarl. "You're still mine! You carry my blood! No one can take that away!" I met his gaze, steady, unflinching. My voice came low and deliberate, each word carved from years of silence. "No, I was never yours. You thought the belts, the blows, the basements would chain me under your heel. But what you really gave me was endurance. You taught me patience, and with it, you built the one thing you could never control, the strength to bring you down." For the first time, something faltered in his expression. His eyes flickered, lips trembling without sound. The fury didn't vanish, but it cracked, revealing a thin sliver of recognition. He saw it, the truth that his downfall was of his own making, forged by his own hands. I rose slowly, placed my palm against the glass, and tapped once. Final. Absolute. The guards glanced up, but I was already turning. My footsteps echoed down the corridor as I walked away, never looking back. For decades, every exit from him had felt unfinished, tied with invisible threads of fear and obedience. But that morning, with the chill seeping into my coat and the silence stretching ahead, I felt them snap. For the first time in my life, I left him behind with nothing binding me to return. I walked out of the prison as the sun dipped low, painting the Fore River in streaks of amber and crimson. Behind me, the iron door clanged shut, its echo rolling down the corridor like a final period at the end of a long, Brutal chapter. The sound followed me out into the crisp air, not as a threat, but as release. A reign of tyranny had ended with that metallic slam. At home. I unpinned the medals from my coat and laid them gently on the table. They couldn't erase the memories, couldn't soften the scars carved years ago, but they marked the journey, from the damp basement where silence was survival to the public courtroom where truth was spoken without fear. They were milestones, not shields. The phone buzzed. My mother's number lit up, and when I answered, there were no words, only the faint rhythm of her breathing. I matched it with my own, an unspoken pact. For the first time, silence between us wasn't born of fear. It was connection. A message followed soon after, my brother's hesitant text glowing on the screen. "You okay?" Just 2 words, but heavy with all that hadn't been said before. I typed back. "Okay, finally." I turned toward the window, watching the last light spread across the water. Freedom didn't come with applause or grand gestures. It arrived quietly, settling deep in my chest as a calm certainty. It was the knowledge that I had drawn a boundary no one could cross again, that my life now belonged wholly to me. This story didn't end with reconciliation, nor with forced forgiveness. It ended with justice, with a line drawn, with the quiet power of a life reclaimed. For the first time, my future stretched open, unbound and unclaimed by anyone but me.